All right, so get this. We're diving into the world of Zen master Kōdō Sawaki today.
Okay.
But forget the tranquil monk image.
Okay.
This guy was known as the homeless Kōdō for a reason.
Hmm.
He traveled constantly, teaching Zen in a way that was anything but quiet and contemplative. He was like that loud, blunt friend who always tells you what you need to hear,
Yeah.
not necessarily what you want to hear.
He definitely had a knack for cutting through the BS, that's for sure. A lot of that stemmed from his background. He had a rough start to life. Lost both his parents by age 7.
Oh, wow.
Being raised by a gambler.
Wow.
Yeah. It exposed him to the harsh realities of life early on.
It sounds like those experiences really shaped his no-nonsense approach to spirituality.
Absolutely. He saw right through the spiritual jargon and sugarcoating. Sawaki believed that true Zen practice wasn't about escaping reality, but about confronting it head-on.
And that's where this book of his sayings to you comes in. It's like he's sitting right here with us, offering up these potent nuggets of wisdom.
Yeah.
For example, he's got this one that just makes me laugh out loud every time I read it. You can't even trade a single fart with the next guy.
It's certainly one way to get your attention, but when you think about it, he's highlighting a profound truth. You are ultimately responsible for your own experience. You can't trade your burdens, your joys, or your bodily functions with anyone else.
Right. It's so easy to fall into the trap of comparing ourselves to others or relying on them to make us happy. Sawaki's basically giving us permission to step out of that cycle and take ownership of our own lives.
Precisely. And that ties into the Buddhist concept of interdependence. Now, I know that might sound counterintuitive, like how can we be both independent and interconnected? But hear me out.
Okay, yes. Let's unpack that because I can see how that could get confusing.
Okay, so interdependence in Buddhism means we're all part of this intricate web of cause and effect. Our actions impact others and their actions impact us. But here's the thing. When we're constantly seeking validation from others, looking to them for our happiness, we're essentially giving away our power. We're not fully showing up as ourselves.
That makes a lot of sense. It's like we're so busy trying to fit into someone else's mold that we lose sight of our own unique shape.
Exactly. And that's where Sawaki's teaching becomes so powerful. He's urging us to break free from that need for external validation and step into our own authenticity. He's got this other zinger where he says, hey, what are you looking at? Don't you see that it's about you?
It's like a Zen slap in the face. In a good way, of course.
Of course. But he's really just trying to shake us awake,
Yeah.
He's pointing to the fact that true freedom comes from realizing that it's about you, in the sense that you have the power to choose how you experience life, regardless of what others think.
Good. Easier said than done, right?
Yeah.
I mean, we live in a world that's constantly telling us who we should be and what we should think. It's like this collective group stupidity.
Yeah.
It's hard to escape. Oh, wait. Did I just steal Sawaki's line?
Yeah, maybe. But he wouldn't mind you borrowing it, because he really hit on something important with that phrase, group stupidity. He wasn't afraid to call out the absurdity of blindly following the crowd, even when it doesn't feel right.
And he wasn't just talking about trivial things either, right?
Right.
I mean, he saw this groupthink mentality playing out in all areas of life, even something as serious as voting.
Absolutely. There's this great anecdote about Sawaki observing people during an election. He was struck by how many people seemed to be voting without really understanding the candidates or the issues.
They were just going through the motions, following the herd. Sounds eerily familiar in this day and age, don't you think?
It sure does. And that's what makes Sawaki's teaching so timeless. He was challenging us to wake up from that kind of blind conformity and engage with the world in a more conscious way.
So it's not about rejecting society altogether, right?
Yeah.
It's more about finding that balance between being part of a community and thinking for ourselves.
Exactly. It's about cultivating a sense of individual awareness within the context of our interconnectedness. And that, my friend, is where things start to get really interesting.
So we're learning to think for ourselves, but what about things outside of ourselves?
Yeah.
Like our relationship to work and money. These are areas where it's so easy to get caught up in what we think we should be doing or how much we think we need. Did Sawaki have anything to say about that?
You bet he did. And you might be surprised to hear that for a Zen master, he had some very pointed, even humorous things to say about money, especially wealth. He once said, and I'm paraphrasing here, I love poking fun at rich people who think they're so important just because they have money. That's probably why they don't give any to me.
I love that he's calling them out, even jokingly. It reminds me of that saying, the best things in life are free. But I feel like we often forget that in our very material-driven world.
It's so easy to get caught in that trap, right? But Sawaki reminds us that true happiness isn't found in material possessions. He said, you can also live without money. No one has come into this world carrying a piggy bank.
That's such a good point. I mean, No one is born with a trust fund attached, but we're conditioned from such a young age to believe that we need money to be happy. So how do we reconcile that? How do we find that balance between, needing money to survive in the real world, but not letting it rule our lives?
I think it comes down to aligning your work with your values. This is a big part of the Buddhist concept of right livelihood.
Right livelihood. It's about more than just earning a paycheck. So what does that look like in practice?
It's about finding work that doesn't cause harm to yourself or others, and that ideally contributes to the well-being of all. And notice I didn't say find your passion. It's not necessarily about finding some dream job that's always fun and exciting.
So you're saying ditch the whole do what you love and you'll never work a day in your life.
Yeah.
Mantra, I must admit, that's kind of a relief to hear.
It's definitely a tall order, but it doesn't mean you have to be stuck in a job you hate. It's about bringing a sense of purpose and mindfulness to whatever work you're doing, even if it's not glamorous or something you'd post about on social media.
That's a really refreshing perspective. It takes the pressure off needing to find that one perfect job.
Right. And it speaks to Sawaki's emphasis on accepting reality as it is. But accepting reality doesn't mean we should settle for mediocrity or unhappiness. It's about finding contentment and meaning in the present moment, even if our work isn't our passion.
Okay, so I've covered work and money, two things that can cause a lot of anxiety and stress. But let's talk about another potentially tricky area, relationships, specifically family and romantic relationships. I have a feeling Sawaki didn't sugarcoat things when it came to this topic either. Did he have any words of wisdom? Or should I say words of realism?
Oh, he definitely brought his signature bluntness to the topic of relationships. He wasn't afraid to challenge our often romanticized notions of love and family.
I'm almost afraid to ask, but go on.
Well, for example, he once said, family is the place where parents and children, husband and wife simultaneously all get on each other's nerves.
Okay, that is brutally honest, but I can't say he's wrong. Families can be wonderful and supportive, but they can also drive us completely crazy sometimes.
He was all about keeping it real, that's for sure. And he didn't stop there. He also had this to say about marriage. Everybody talks about marrying for love, but isn't it really just marrying for sex?
Wow. Okay. Tell us how you really feel, Sawaki. That's definitely a conversation starter. I can imagine him just dropping that bomb at a dinner party and watching everyone squirm.
He certainly knew how to push people's buttons, but like most of his teachings, there's a deeper point hidden beneath the provocative statement. He's challenging us to examine our motivations and expectations, especially when it comes to something as loaded as marriage.
So he's saying, look past just the surface level of why we get into relationships and what we expect to get out of them. There's a lot to think about there.
It goes back to those core Buddhist principles we keep coming back to, impermanence and attachment.
Right. Remind me again how those concepts relate to relationships.
Well, impermanence reminds us that everything changes.
I see.
Nothing stays the same. And that includes our relationships. People change. Our situations change.
Right.
And that's okay. That's just part of life, part of how things work.
It's so easy to get caught up in wanting things to stay the same,
Yeah.
especially with people we love.
Mm.
But clinging to that desire for things to never change, well, it can lead to a lot of suffering.
Exactly. And that's where attachment comes in. Attachment is that clinging, to people, to experiences, even to ideas of how we think things should be. And when those things change, and they always do, we experience pain and disappointment, even anger.
So how do we apply this understanding of impermanence and attachment to our relationships? Like, how can we actually use this in our lives? Because it's one thing to understand it intellectually, but to actually live it, especially in relationships where things can get messy. It's a whole other thing.
You're absolutely right. It's not always easy, but I think awareness is the first step, Start paying attention to how you react when things don't go as planned in your relationships, when your partner does something that bothers you, or your family dynamics shift. Notice that initial urge to cling, to control, the urge to force things back to how they used to be.
So it's about bringing that same mindfulness we cultivate in meditation to our relationships.
Exactly. It's about observing our thoughts and feelings and reactions without judgment. And then from that place of awareness, we can start to make choices that are aligned with greater wisdom and compassion, both for ourselves and for the people we're in relationship with.
It sounds like it takes a lot of courage to show up in our relationships that way, with that level of honesty and vulnerability.
It does. And that's maybe what I find most inspiring about Sawaki's teachings. He doesn't shy away from the difficult stuff. He reminds us that true growth, true awakening often requires us to face our fears and insecurities head on, even when it comes to our own mortality, something most of us would rather avoid thinking about altogether.
Oh, right. We haven't even touched on his perspective on death, which I imagine was as unconventional as everything else about him.
You're catching on. He had a very direct, almost shocking way of addressing it. He once said, "You're worried about death. Don't worry, you'll die for sure."
Leave it to Sawaki to just come right out and say it. But I can see what he's doing there. He's using that blunt honesty to shake us out of our complacency, to wake us
Uh,
up to the preciousness of life.
Exactly. He's not being morbid. He's trying to free us from that fear so that we can actually live more fully.
So it's about taking that fear, that awareness of our own mortality, and using it as fuel to make the most of the time we have.
Precisely. And that's a practice we can cultivate every single day. We can ask ourselves, if I knew I only had a limited amount of time left, how would I choose to live? What really matters to me? What relationships would I nurture? What experiences would I prioritize?
Those are powerful questions to reflect on. And it makes me think about that anecdote you mentioned earlier about the second Zen patriarch, Ika, who was so determined to study with Bodhidharma that he stood outside in the snow all night. He even cut off his own arm to prove his commitment.
It's a pretty extreme example, but it illustrates the depth of commitment and willingness to go to great lengths to awaken to truth.
It makes me wonder, what seemingly crazy things are we willing to do to break free from the patterns that keep us stuck, the fears that hold us back from living a truly meaningful life?
That's a question each of us has to answer for ourselves. But I believe that by engaging with Sawaki's teachings, by grappling with his sometimes shocking, often humorous, always insightful wisdom, we open ourselves to the possibility of a more awake and fulfilling life.
Well said. And speaking of engaging with his teachings, I highly recommend you check out his book, To You. It's full of these little Zen grenades that are sure to shake up your thinking and maybe even change your life.
Absolutely. It's a wild and wonderful ride through the mind of a true original.
And on that note, we'll leave you with one final thought from the master himself, which I think perfectly encapsulates what we've been exploring today. Buddha's teaching can only be practiced by yourself.
So true. It's a reminder that ultimately this is an inner journey. And while we can learn from teachers and teachings, the real work happens within each of us.
Beautifully put.
Yeah.
So until next time, keep diving deep and remember you've got this.